And we're live. Hi, everyone. Very good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's a pleasure to have you with us. Let's take a few seconds to allow people from the waiting room to move into the main session. I do see people jumping from one room to the other. All right, while we wait for people to move from a room to the other, hi, I'm here again. My name is Himanshu Shekhar. I work at United Nations University, Institute for Environment and Human Security, UNU-EHS at Bonn in Germany. And it's a pleasure to have you with us for this day 2 of Climate Academy 2023 virtual sessions. The session we have today is called National Perspective on Planned Relocation. And before we jump into session, kindly allow me to thank our partners, Munich Re Foundation, and the Academy is organized in association in collaboration with UN Climate Change Secretariat, UNFCCC, and International Organization for Migration, IOM. With this, I invite the host for today's session, Kees van Geest from UNU-EHS, to take us forward. Kees, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Himanshu, and welcome everybody. This is the second public panel session of the resilience of the Climate Academy of this year on planned relocation. A warm welcome. Yesterday we had a great opening event with a great keynote by Anthony Oliver Smith and other great interventions from key experts in the field. And today we are having 3 speakers from different parts of the world, and we take a more national perspective on planned relocation, but always national in relation to community voices on planned relocation. So some of the topics we will be looking at are like national legal and policy frameworks for planned relocation, standard operating procedures, and we have a number of guiding questions, which include, for example, when does or should a national conversation about relocation begin? At what point should governments and ministries start thinking about planned relocation? How do governments engage with communities on this topic? And what national frameworks already exist today that talk about planned relocation? What are like financial backgrounds of planned relocation? How to fund it at a national level? So what kind of support do planners need? So all these questions, our speakers will be touching on them, and many others that are relevant for this national level. So we're going to have 3 speakers today. I see Filimone had some difficulty joining this session, but I'm really happy to see you, Filimone. Glad you made it. Welcome. Are you in Fiji at the moment?
Yes, Kees. Yeah, joining in from Fiji. Very nice to be on here and looking forward to the discussions. Thank you.
Great. It must be evening time at your end. So many thanks for joining us. So yes, we're going to have 3 speakers. Filimone Ralogaivau. I hope I pronounced that well. Yeah, great. And Chandni, Singh, and Nishara, Fernando. That would also be the speaking order of today, with Filimone starting. So just a few words of introduction of Filimone. So Filimone is a climate adaptation officer in the office of the Prime Minister in Fiji, and the team he leads work on the standard operation procedures for planned relocation in Fiji, and they also set up the Climate Relocation of Communities Trust Fund. And Filimone, I'm sure you're going to give us much more detail about these activities in your presentation. So before I will introduce the other speakers after this first presentation. So Filimone, are you able to share your screen for the PowerPoint? There's the green button in the middle, at the bottom.
Yeah, apologies. I'm facing some technical difficulties on my end. I had emailed over the presentation. If
Yeah,
you could,
you want me? Well, but if I share it, then you would have some. You can let me know when I have to move to the next slide, right?
yeah, that'll
Just
do.
1 second, then. Just a second. Is this visible to everybody?
Yes, Kees, but not in the presentation mode yet. I think it's, yeah, all good. Please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Kees. Apologies for that, panelist and the viewers in Bolivinaka from the Fiji Islands. It's a pleasure to be here and share some of our experiences of planned relocation here in Fiji. Next slide, please. So here in Fiji, as many of you know that have an interest in planned relocation, we had established quite an extensive, comprehensive set of policies, legislation that could assist us with the planned relocation of communities due to the impacts of climate change. We have seen the intensification of tropical cyclones. What would we have experienced in a period of over 10 to 20 years, we are now experiencing in less than 5 years. So with this, we have more displaced communities and the need for them to be relocated to safer homes. So in 2018, Fiji endeavored into the first its planned relocation guidelines, which has set the guidelines and the basis of relocation of our communities. And this was followed by the displacement guidelines. So this would assist in the context of climate change and disasters, flooding, landslides, tropical cyclones, wiping out whole communities, them in the state of displacement. This was a set of guidelines to assist the relevant stakeholders on the operations. This was followed then by the Climate Relocation of Communities Trust Fund, commonly known as the Relocation Trust Fund. This was just the fund that we had established here in Fiji that looked into how we finance the relocation of our communities, being that this is a state-led process. So bilateral grants that are given by our development partners, neighboring countries, this goes directly into this trust fund. And a substantial portion of this as well is seeded through an environment climate levy known as the ECAL, commonly known as ECAL, where 3% of a taxation or levy that is put on luxury services. So the berthing of yachts to our shores, 3% of that goes into the trust fund. We also have a plastic levy, 3% of that goes into this trust fund, and departure tax. And so this greatly assists us when we are caught in situations where communities need to relocate. Additionally, this was then further mandated by the Climate Change Act, which gives mandate to authorizing bodies. So we have a climate relocation task force, which is made up of the different ministries that are involved in the relocation of our communities, and they have to be either in director level or permanent secretary level. So at a very high level of leadership within these ministries. And they act as a role as like the quality assurance. So whatever major decisions that come that is related to relocation, whether it is related to accessing the trust fund, whether it's related to the housing plans, whether it's related to the new site that they'll be need to move to, or even whether it is they're moving in the first place. And we have to present to the task force that all the requirements had been met. So from that, then this year we had established quite an important document, the standard operating procedure for planned relocation. This was launched earlier in the year. So before this standard operating procedure, we had relocated about 6 communities. And from those lessons, from that experience, this SOP was born. It helps us better coordinate the implementing entities on the ground, and also how we manage the activities, how we manage the financing of these activities, so that we can relocate our communities in a more humane and efficient manner through better coordination. Next slide, please. So this is just some snippets that I would like to share with you all. So an experience of relocation is a measure of last resort. So just like anywhere, relocation for us here in Fiji is a measure of last resort. We have to exhaust all adaptation interventions, technology that is available here in Fiji before we relocate. So this was one of the quotes. Managing difficult trade-offs in exchange for a safer and more resilient future in Wunindongolo village in Wonolebu. So as you see in this photo here, this is one of our relocated communities in Wonolebu, Wunindongolo. A lot of lessons learned from this relocation. Not an easy experience for the members of this community, but very much so something that we are learning on and taking on board to improve, and also going back and monitoring how well they're doing with improving their lives as well in their new homes. Next slide, please. So life on the principle of climate crisis. This is in another village of Tukuraki, find new hope. So as you can see here, the villagers celebrating their new homes, having been living in quite a red zone, which was very vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. They had moved inland. As you can see here, their celebration of safety and just the joy of this whole project coming to an end, because this was no easy task for them as well, having to wait and having to and for government to coordinate all our efforts in a coordinated way. So here's them rejoicing. This is their first day, which the new site was opened and handed over to them. Next slide, please. So this is another village, Narikoso, slow onset, loss, and new beginnings in Narikoso. Here's another village with the same experience. As you can see from the houses there, gradual improvements in how the villages are set up, very different housing designs, the village setup. All these things are quite integral to our village setting. Next slide, please. So Fiji's policy-based and legal definitions of planned relocation. So in Fiji, planned relocation is a solution-oriented measure involving the state, in which a community as a distinct from an individual household is physically moved to another location and resettled there permanently. This is quoted from our planned relocation guidelines. Planned relocation means the action undertaken to permanently relocate or resettle a community or group. This is from our Climate Change Act. So this just further clarifies the different types of relocation. We have, in some instances, temporary relocation, whereas planned relocation is more of a permanent resettlement of a group of people. Next slide, please. So the standard operating procedure, based on the previous experiences with relocation, as I had earlier spoke on, both positive and negative, which have been improved in understanding of the contextual consideration and needs specific to Fiji. The approach taken is guided by a close awareness of the cultural linkages and importance of natural assets and ancestral sites and other non-economic values. So just in this regard, this is something that we are currently developing as well. The impact of the impact of relocation on culture, gender, how that can be realized. We are now formulating reports through various consultations, and for it to be published, and something that is there to better inform our practitioners, our implementers on the ground when they're relocating communities in the near future. So the SOP provides a structure for progressing community requests, consultations along technical assessments, legal processes, and financial planning. So again, just like any SOP, it is quite important in how we manage all these different important characteristics of relocation, whether it is coordinating the efforts of our different ministries, coordinating how our NGOs can come into play and add value, and also the coordinating the impact of this to the community themselves. The consultation process, the consensus process, and also the impact of this on our marginalized groups, kids and members of our LGBTQI community. Next slide, please. So the reason you see here that this is just a snapshot of this whole coordination that this diagram hopes to assist our implementers with. So the process of screening and scoping in the first stage of relocation, and then we have the additional stage of relocation and establishment, which you will see here finally allotted to, and then post-stage, which includes the monitoring and evaluation. And all these are subcategorized into the different letters, and depending on the type of communities that we are relocating, they will be directed to the right portion of the different processes in this SOP. This SOP is available online. You can access it through just a Google search, or you can also come onto our Fiji's climate change portal, which has this policy also available on. Next slide, please. So again, something similar to what was said before, but this just elaborates on the institutional arrangements. So from the community requests to processing community requests and screening, scoping, and initial risk assessments. You can see there under C, screening, scoping requests, the Fiji Task Force on Relocation, which I had spoken on earlier, and their role in this process. You'll also see under that is the CRVAM. This is the Comprehensive Risk and Vulnerability Assessment Methodology. It is our climate risk and vulnerability assessment tool, where we get a risk scoring for communities that need to be relocated, and this is presented to the task force for the approval before we put it up to the minister responsible for climate change, who gives the final okay. And other portions that you will see there from district advisory councils. District advisory council, this is more linked towards our informal communities. And here in Fiji, we have two different types. We have an informal community and a formal community, or Itauke, or indigenous people, their village setting, that has a different process altogether. Whereas we have informal community, something like squatter settlements in other countries, they have a different process to follow. Next slide, please.
Filimone, just we're kind of running out of time for this one. Maybe if you would try to wrap up in maybe 1 minute.
Sure. So, sorry about that. But
Yeah,
yes, happy to answer any questions after this. And you can also reach out to me. My contact is available on our climate change portal. And thank you very much for this opportunity. A lot of lessons Fiji has learned, and we're trying to improve on. We are now relocating a community. We're actually in the process of relocating a community, Namba Vatu, in Ralogaivau, that have been displaced now, unfortunately, for over 2 years. And the issue we had faced was the funding, how we fund the relocation of this community. And now that we have the funding, we're finally relocating them. Thank you very much, and looking forward to the remaining speakers.
Thanks a lot, Filimone, for this really, for great sharing of the experience of Fiji. I think most of us know that Fiji has really been kind of a champion of starting work on this and coming up with these kind of national level documents and agreements on how to deal with planned relocation. And what I really liked to see in the start of your presentation, how this doesn't suddenly, standing operation procedures that do not suddenly exist. There's a long history of several steps and years where you learn from the experiences, and I'm sure that after so we're going to have the three presentations first, and then a Q&A. But I'm sure there are lots of people who would like to know more about these experiences and what were the kind of lessons learned in the process. But I would like to now move to the second speaker of today, which is Chandni, Dr. Chandni Singh. She's a senior researcher at the Indian Institute for Human Settlements, and she's also really a global expert on climate change, adaptation, disaster risk, vulnerability, and also climate mobility, rural-urban migration. So there are many overlaps with the work that UNU-EHS is also doing, and my group, and was nice to have Chandni as a visiting scientist at the Institute recently. Chandni is also IPCC author in the Sixth Assessment Report, and especially the 1.5 special report. So Chandni, it's really an honor and a pleasure to have you here. And if you'd like to share your screen, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Kees. And I really enjoyed listening to the example from Fiji. Lots to learn from there for many countries, I think. So thanks so much for that. All right, so I will be today talking about some insights from India. The conversation that I want to have is actually slightly broader than planned relocation, but I'll touch upon aspects of that. Sorry, I'm just trying to... I can see a lot of the Zoom things and I'm not able to see my slides. So just a second. Yeah, all right. So this work is actually from around 6-7 years of research that we've been doing in the east and southeast part of India, which is has a long coast and also is highly exposed to both cyclones, storm surges, and then also floods. So there's been a long history of all kinds of recovery measures from these coastal areas. And one of them, of course, is relocating people away from the coast and moving them inland. And I just want to talk about what that means. Lots of successes, but also then lots of challenges when coastal communities are moved away from the coast. Oh. All right, so just for a bit of context, for those of you not so familiar with India, and because this is a session on national policy around relocation, there's been a long history, of course. The present day policies on disaster management that we see are deeply rooted in India's colonial history. India, the frame that was used really to think about relief and recovery from disasters tended to focus mainly on that immediate space just after the disaster. So it was very relief oriented. And also there was always this hierarchy between the ones who are affected by disasters and recipients of relief versus the one who is providing it. And that's why that was a very transactional approach, where there was not this idea of how do you actually build resilience of people who are being affected by disasters. And so that sort of colonial hangover carried on when India got its independence in 1947, and this focus on thinking about relief, more importantly, rather than long-term resilience building remained. And also, of course, because India as a country was coming out of this long period of colonization, there was also inadequate state capacity to think about preparedness and think about long-term measures. So why I mention all of this is to reiterate that I think sometimes when we go in thinking about resilience building, climate change adaptation, disaster management, we tend to forget that what the problems that we see today are actually rooted in very deep histories of state capacity and just ways of doing things. So upturning some of those things are often very challenging. And then, of course, if we come to the more recent past or recent times in India, we have had, because of our long coastline, we see recurring cyclones. And the 1999 super cyclone, which hit the state of Orissa in East India, as well as the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, both of these were very large-scale events that really caused extreme damage, both in terms of losses of life, but also infrastructural damage. And it was really this moment where the national government, both these were actually the 1999 super cyclone for the state government, that's one level below the nation, and then the 2004 tsunami as for the national government, a wake up really to think about disaster management in a more holistic way, and therefore sort of even think about moving beyond relief to recovery, and also relocation being one of those things. And that's when the Disaster Management Act in India was set up. And as the 2000s progressed, there's been this big focus on zero casualties. So ensuring that at least at bare minimum, all the plans that are in place should follow a zero casualties approach, no deaths. And of course, in parallel, I'm sure many of you know about this, there were various changes happening in disaster management globally with the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction coming in. So you've got these global narratives that are moving towards thinking about resilience building back better as one of the ideas, and really thinking about preparedness as a key part to reduce deaths and reduce damages because of disasters. And so a mix of these two things, extreme events increasing as well as global and national priorities changing, India really started moving towards a more preparatory approach. And a couple of things that the country did is invest a lot into early warning systems, have very large programs on community awareness and preparedness. And then finally, one of the things that also gained a lot of prominence is planned relocation, where people, because of increasing exposure to cyclones and floods, people being moved inwards away from the coast. So during this time, also what happened is, how do you actually do this planned relocation? And India, although I think in recent times is often now seen as this emerging economy, which is with high growth, at least in the late 90s and early 2000s, was still struggling and still is struggling with a very large population that is also poor, and difficulties in funding this kind of building of new infrastructure, shifting people away from the coast. And a lot of this reconstruction work post a disaster or relocation in preparation for a disaster has been through multilateral agencies and then implemented on the ground through the government, as well as with civil society partners or non-governmental organizations. And so it's always been a mix of these various actors really implementing planned relocation in our coastal areas. And when we talk about, I would like to mention that actually planned relocation is not the terminology that the government really uses or is even commonly understood. Actually, when you talk to people, even people who are implementing these projects, more often they talk about reconstruction, rebuilding, and relocation and resettlement. These are the terms that one tends to hear, where reconstruction is around infrastructure reconstruction, rebuilding of different types of livelihoods, and also infrastructure attached to those livelihoods. And then finally, resettlement or relocation, which is the physical moving of people from one place to another. And in all of this, I think...
Chandni, just you still have like 3 or 4 minutes, but I know you have quite a few slides,
right.
and you're only on your 3rd slide, I think. So just to be aware that you don't have so much time.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Yeah, so just to highlight that, I think in all of this, there's much less attention being paid to. While there's such a focus on building, there's been less attention to the psychosocial aspects of disasters. And that's why relocation is just seen as one of the ways to enable people to get out of a risk-prone situation without realizing that there are many other things that are needed to actually rebuild livelihoods and so on. So this is an example, this particular one is an example of after people have been moved from coastal areas, they are often put up in houses like this. These people are often fishing communities, and then they moved into these multi-storied houses where these colonies, first of all, change the nature of the way you live in a place, because people often lived in single-storied huts and now put up in these kinds of houses. But also these houses were built often upon other risky areas. So in this case, these houses were also flooded because they were built on wetlands. So there's the element of also trying to understand why are people being moved from one risk into the other. All right, I will skip this. So what I really want to focus on here is to say that why are we repeatedly seeing this kind of relocation that might, the intention is absolutely noble and good, and moving people out of harm's way is, of course, no one can deny that that's important, but somehow people are still, the outcomes of this moving is often not as intended. And this is where we started trying to ask, why is this repeatedly happening? And one of the reasons we try to say is the way we are understanding disaster events themselves and the kinds of solutions we are presenting to them is what perhaps is the problem in the first place. So these are the kinds of newspaper, these are just some ideas of the newspaper clips that we see after particular cyclones and flood events that happen in, at least in this case, in Tamil Nadu in India. And often these kinds of narratives tend to say that disasters are these unprecedented events, unknowable, they're just completely different from anything we have known. And this kind of narrative is very different from the reality of disasters, which is that they're happening all the time. Coastal areas do have cyclones repeatedly, so they're recurring. And often many of these disasters also are man-made, so they aren't always completely climatic in nature. So this is one set of ideas I just want to put out. And the second set of things that we often, the way that people and their losses after disaster are represented are also in certain ways. So here are again a couple of clips, newspaper clips, and they tend to be typically these narratives around disaster losses and damages in terms of economic impacts, infrastructural losses, and they're always aggregated. So many $1 million worth of infrastructure loss, so many thousand people were injured or lost their lives. And so these aggregates tend to sort of mask what is actually happening on the ground. And many a times they're not able to capture the intangible damages that people face. For example, mental trauma after disaster and so on. So why I was talking about the reason for bringing up these narratives around disaster events as well as disaster impacts is that those narratives lead to the kinds of recovery interventions that we think of. And therefore you think of relocation and moving people away from the coast and putting them in houses and building certain types of houses as a way of relocation, which may not always be the way. Perhaps if one is to ask these disaster affected people themselves. And so from the top down, or from the state in I think, not to critique it, but to actually say that in all fairness, I mean, because of these narratives of build back better, there tends to be this focus on recovering through rebuilding, through repairing infrastructure, and then actually relocating people. And often this relocation tends to be seen as a one-time fix that you do, where people are taken from the coast and then moved inland. In all the sites that I have studied, people have been even moved up to 100 kilometers away from the coast, which is absolutely devastating, as you can imagine, for someone whose identity and cultural practices and livelihoods are really on the coast. On the other side, we spoke to a lot of people on the ground, and their ideas of recovery are not one time, they are ongoing. Recovery is long-term, and recovery is also multiple things. So of course, people want their house and they want their temple built, for example, but they also want trees to be, that were affected to be brought back. They want their roads and they want their schools to be also built in the place that they are living in. And so relocation really is a last resort measure for many communities. And while that is what the sense you get from people themselves who are affected by these kinds of extreme events, relocation is often a measure that is that the state tends to take on much faster than the people are ready to accept. I know I really rushed through the slides, but I did want to get to this last bit, which is that I think the broader story, at least in India, but I also know in much of South Asia, has been that relocation and resettlement, whether because of disasters or because of other non-climatic events, have always been taking place. And I think they will continue to, especially as places get even more hazard prone. So I think my criticism around relocation is not to say that like a single sentence, not to say that it should not happen at all. I think under certain conditions and for certain places, it is necessary, but it's one of the solutions, and perhaps the conditions under which post-disaster relocation is happening is what we need to think about, especially because post a disaster, I mean, it's that moment where some people call it a moment of opportunity to really change where people are, I mean, the development story of a particular place. And these disaster events, as I said, the way we understand them, often people talk about them as unprecedented or natural events also, but we need to understand that many of them, especially for communities living in very exposed areas, they are actually events that they are seeing repeatedly, and often they intersect. So these climatic events intersect with development deficits already existing to change the nature of the disaster. So understanding that is particularly important. And then also slightly diversifying the way we think about impacts and losses are very important, because that really then plays a role in how we think about the so-called building back better and think about recovery that is beyond infrastructural recovery. So our own work, and I think also in various countries, it's the first step, of course, is sort of deciding whether people should or can relocate. But the second more difficult step is, I think, the conditions under which people are relocating, but also the places they are relocating into. And while there's a lot of focus on the built infrastructure that we provide there, but also providing some sort of attention to how you rebuild societies when you move them, but also the kinds of interactions they have with the local environment once they move from environments and ecologies that they have a deep history with to completely new ones is also important to keep in mind. I'll stop there. And if you want to know more about this project, you can, it's called Recovery with Dignity.
Thank you, Chandni. It was great to also hear these experiences from India, and it's interesting to see also kind of the differences, right? There will probably be some questions about this, but I had also the feeling that the relocations you were talking about were not as, can I say, like planned or based on existing guidelines or even standard operating procedures. So it's interesting to see these differences also between places. Our next speaker is going to be Nishara Fernando, but I want to quickly give the floor to Himanshu, who is going to explain a little bit on how to ask questions, actually, because we're going to have half an hour more or less still for Q&A. Yeah, Himanshu.
Yeah, thanks, Kees. And Nishara, sorry to keep you waiting, but for our audiences, thanks a lot for your amazing interest. I do see that one of the participants has his or her hand up. So we recommend that you put your question, if you have any, in the Q&A tab. That also allows the panelists to choose whether the question pertains to them directly or not. At the same time, if you wish, you can also put that in chat and we will bring it back in the Q&A. So that's the small housekeeping, and back to you, Kees.
Thanks, Himanshu. Yeah, so we are moving from India to Sri Lanka with our next speaker, Nishara Fernando. Nishara is a professor of sociology at the University of Colombo in Sri Lanka. And he's actually one of the few academics that I know of who have been working on the topic of planned relocation in the context of climate change already for many years. It's like, that's one of the reasons also why we organize this academy to really kind of boost also the academic work on this topic. And he's one of the few people who have really been working on that topic for a long time. And he's also a long-term collaborator with United Nations University, did his PhD in Bonn, where we are based. And some of the work that we collaborated on with my predecessor, Coco Warner, also dates back to around 50 years ago. So it's really nice to have Nishara with us today to continue this collaboration. Nishara, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Kees, and thank you for giving me this opportunity. And I have not prepared any slides, but I just would like to present a few points with regard to the questions that you have already listed, and also the topic on this institutional and government frameworks. I think let me just start my I would say like a presentation or discussion. As all of us know, people could be displaced and also could be relocate and also resettle due to war, natural hazards, development projects, and also due to climate change. But my point is that here, now when it comes to relocation, which is a huge task, and based on my research which I have done in Sri Lanka, I would suggest relocate if it is necessary, relocate if it is necessary. So, which is why I'm saying so, because this will create huge amount of problems, because we are not dealing with a planned relocation. Because I think first we also need to clearly define what do we mean by planned relocation. But now, for instance, when you say that, like when government involved, are we going to say that, are we going to consider it as planned relocation? I think I have, explored most of the government policies in Sri Lanka, World Bank, and ADB. I don't think that they have identified relocation as a process. I think this is also very, very vital for us. Relocation is a process. So where there are stages of relocation, like before, soon after, sometime after, long time after. So I can identify there are I would say 4 stages. So if someone wants to talk about relocation first, even a policy should equip or clearly identify relocation as a process. So I think the main gap that I have already identified, most of the policies, they are very much concerned about 2 main stages, before and soon after, and they have neglected sometime after and long time after. So as a result of that, most of the vulnerable people whom we have relocated, they have already moved out of the locations. So sometimes, I don't know whether you have come across Robert Muga's book on relocation failures in Sri Lanka, which is a very important book that all of you should read, because he argues, when it comes to development-induced displacement, relocation, war, or even natural hazards related displacement and relocation, most of the projects have already been failed. So I think, nowadays, when it comes to relocation in the South, we are always talking about failures. But there are positive cases, because another important aspect here with regard to relocation is, like, it's not voluntary, it's involuntary, it's forced. Now, if you take 2004 tsunami, after the 2004 tsunami, the Sri Lankan government took a decision to reimpose the buffer zone regulation. So as a result of that, 70,000 families were forcibly relocated into unsafe, insecure areas. So we have been studying Gaul as a case study for the last 20 years. Now, 128,000 people were displaced in Gaul, and even the Gaul city, most of the fishermen and also who were relying on city-based income-earning activities have forcibly relocated into rural areas. Now, 20 years after, we have seen most of the families have already come back to the buffer zone. So the question is, when you ask the question, okay, now what is going to happen if there is another tsunami 20 years after, 25 years after? People have different statements. They say that, we know what is tsunami, we will get the evacuation call on time, we know where to run, but they don't have an answer to a particular question. Okay, what is going to happen? Sometimes they will also argue that, they can save their lives, but then the point is, what is going to happen to your movable and immovable property? So they don't have a particular answer for that. So what they normally say is that, the government will look after. So my point is, now here we don't have proper policies for relocation, especially with regard to Sri Lanka. So then sometimes you might ask the question, then how different governments relocate different groups of people? So normally, because we have one policy called NIRP, National Involuntary Resettlement Policy, where they have captured most of the important aspects. As I mentioned you before, they have considered only before and soon after stages, but they have not considered relocation as a process. So they are that policy clearly state that the government or the implementing agency should closely monitor and evaluate these relocated groups at least for 5 years. So that is one of the important policy decision taken, mentioned in the NIRP policy. Other than that, when it comes to relocation, there are ad hoc policies. For instance, if you take recently the National Building Research Organization, they are now into relocation of people who were exposed to landslides. But what they did was, they got a cabinet approval for a particular, I would say, a guideline. In that guideline, they were very much into self-housing. And in that guideline, they have clearly mentioned how much money that they are going to give for a family to construct the house, 1.2 million, another 400,000 rupees to purchase the land, altogether 1.6 package. That's all. And so you can see that they are very much concerned about how to purchase a land, and also how much they have allocated, and also then how much money they will give in stages to construct the house. So in that case also, they have not considered relocation, I would say, as a process. And also now when you look into this different policies, we have I have identified sometimes, so there are like a positive aspects. Like, for example, now people have given several options other than just moving into relocated settlements or donor-built settlements. There are options which are given in some selected policy documents where people can also go for self-help housing. But most of the people who have already moved into these places, they always complain that the money that they have allocated to construct the house is not sufficient. So they should need more money to complete their housings, and also they are grappling with all other issues. For instance, conflict between host and resettled communities, and also difficult they were moved into places far away from the city. So city dwellers have become rural dwellers, and also there are hidden inherent vulnerabilities like caste, ethnicity, gender related issues, which have not been considered in the policy document. So I think so with regard to my experience, there are policy documents which have already been implemented by different organizations. Like, for example, in some cases, in the recent case, there was a project called CRIP, Climate Resilience Improvement Project, where they wanted to protect the river banks in Colombo and outer, where we can attempt to relocate thousands of people with the help of World Bank, where that was clearly implemented by the irrigation department, because most of the rivers are protected and monitored by the irrigation department. So so that program has not been implemented yet, because there were a lot of issues with regard to how much they spend for relocation, how much they are going to get from the government, and also from the World Bank and from all the other sources. So in that case, I just want to show that, you know, there are different organizations involving resettlements, and we don't have a common policy or national policy as such. So as a result of that, I would say that, you know, this has opened for I would say relocation failures. I don't want to say that, you know, there are no positive cases. There are, but the point is, you know, different times, different government officials, they don't like to repeat some of the best practices due to different reasons. I would identify this as relocation, politics of relocation, because different governments have different agendas and different policies. So sometimes, you know, they don't want to repeat the positive cases. So as a result of that, also interfering of politics has also forced some of the people to stay in the poverty cycle. And I think so we don't have a common policy in place. There are ad hoc policies, and also I also have to stress this. I'm telling this based on my experience and based on the research that I have conducted. Most of the officials who are involved in relocate, who are constructing policies, and also who are implementing these policies at the local level, they don't have much experience on relocation. So as a result of that, I mean, we normally try to relocate people with the intention of protecting their lives and improving their lives in a different location. But I have to say that, you know, sometimes they have to suffer for 1 or 2 generations as a result of these improper policies. So with that, I think I will stop my short intervention, and I'm happy to answer your questions in the question and answer session. Thank you, Reese.
Thank you very much, Nishara. I think the 3 presentations we've had today really show some of the kind of challenges and difficulties of how to do planned relocation well, and also maybe from the first presentation some kinds of pointers towards how to overcome some of these challenges. We have still half an hour. Thanks also for keeping to the time. We still have half an hour for Q&A. There are already some questions in the Q&A, where you, how do you call that, the Q&A folder or so. Thanks for that. I think it could be helpful if the presenters can read some of those questions. It's a pity that in this setup people cannot really take the floor and ask the question in that way. But I have the advantage that I can ask you some questions personally. So I think it is maybe nice to also do it, like start for a moment with a few questions from me. And I would really invite all the other participants, we're almost 50 people, to share your questions. And these can be specific to one presenter or more general. If it's not a question, if you want to comment, like share an observation, also speakers can share their perspective on your comments. I would like to start with a question to Filimone, and maybe I will try to be short in my questions. I think to keep the discussion dynamic, it's helpful if we do kind of like ping pong, like fast, short questions, short answers. So just to Filimone, I have actually a few questions to you, but I'm going to have to choose one. One of the things that struck me, and which I thought was very positive, was that these standard operating procedures are really based on learning from previous experiences. Yeah, these can be positive and negative experiences. You mentioned the 6 communities that have been relocated before, and it's great that the experiences have been taken on board for the SOPs. But could you give us maybe just a few examples of either positive or negative experiences in those first relocations that were taken into account for the SOPs?
Thanks. Thank you for the question. I think very importantly, one of the lessons that we'd learned from the previous relocation through our engagement with the communities themselves that have been relocated is just the importance of consultation involving them in the whole process of major decisions that would impact them in terms of their movement. So for this new SOP, just for a community to be relocated, there's a 90% requirement where the community needs to sit down and decide. And 90% of them need to say yes to relocate. And from then on, we decided that about 60% would be needed for other, but just for them to be relocated is about a 90% need. We can come in and practice free, prior, informed consent, go to the ground, do the assessments, and come in and present to them. But at the end of the day, they have the final say. And for all different stages as well, the types of houses, the layout of the new communities, the sites that they will need to choose. Yes, I think that was an important thing, learning from previous relocations. Positive lessons is just the communities themselves taking ownership of the relocation process, whether it is through the providence of their natural resources, whether they have timber or gravel, or even just manpower. Them coming in and actually being part of that process gives them ownership of this very big task ahead of relocating a group of people. And lastly, I think is just the monitoring how these communities are doing, especially post-relocation. Can be all celebrations when we put them to the new communities, but after certain periods, the reality sets in that this will be their new home. And being coastal dwellers or a group of people that were located by a riverbank, moving inland, which is the only option, is something very daunting that they have to live with. Thanks.
Thank you, Filimone. Over to Chandni. Yeah, it was good to see these examples, and also nice that you use these pictures of what such a resettlement, for example, also looks like, and how these are sometimes maybe in flood-prone areas and difficulties around that. One of the things that struck me was it looked like the planned relocation were kind of more ad hoc or spontaneous. Well, not spontaneous is not the right word, but just kind of, yeah, less planned than, for example, the case of Fiji. So, but on the other hand, like I don't know India so well, but I do always have the impression that India is a very kind of state-led, organized country with a very strong state who's really tries to, control things quite a bit. So maybe you could, speak a little bit towards that. Like, are these relocations that you have talked about in your presentation, what is the kind of legal and embedding and the guideline? Are these relocations based on guidelines or something like standard operating procedures?
Yeah, thanks, Kees. So yes, I think the state, of course, does have a strong presence. And the story, that's why I spoke about disaster management so much, because all of this tends to fall under disaster management in the country. So that's why we have a nested system of disaster management authorities from the national to the state to the district level, and they sort of are tasked with the job of, first of all, assessing the needs of people post a disaster, and then actually seeing what's the way forward in terms of or even in preparation to particular hazards, do you need to relocate people or so on. What from my own work in reality, what ends up happening is you don't have clear start and end points to some of these relocation projects. There are these waves of relocation that have taken place, because every year you know that there are going to be cyclones in particular places. And so actually we have been to sites where you will have after the 2004 tsunami, you have a set of relocation projects that come in that, of course, then each project has its own sort of guidelines about the kinds of houses that are going to be built, the number of people, the amount of community participation, or at least engagement that is needed to decide who's going to move and in what stages. And then there will be another cyclone and another one. And so there are waves of relocation that have taken place. So many people actually have, in some of these colonies you go, they've come from different disasters, really. So it's a little more messy, I would say, in that sense, compared to, for example, the Fiji example, which has a very clear top-down, but also, not only top-down, but I would say community-centric approach to relocation. I think it's much more top-down here in India. But also to say it is, while there is a strong element of community participation and engaging with people to talk about relocation, their engagement is curtailed in the sense they don't decide what types of houses get built, how those houses are going to be structured, and all of that, how large are playgrounds, those kinds of things are not part of the community engagement. So I think there's a very limited role that is imagined for people's voices coming into designing of these relocation projects, which I find quite different from the Fiji example.
Thank you, Chandni. Yeah, it's interesting to see these differences between countries, and it's something I think we will come back to throughout this academy, like the importance of like context, and that can be cultural context, but also political context in this case, and how that might also affect the level of standardization one can achieve in terms of planning, and also whether something that works in one place could also work in the other place, and how to maybe even when you recognize these differences, does it still make sense to have some level of standardization? So over to Nishara, and please do have a look also at the questions in the Q&A. There are now 5. So Nishara, you put quite a bit of emphasis on that relocation is a process, right? And it's not a one-off intervention, but that also makes it more complicated from a policy and planning perspective. And that, from what I understood from what you said on Sri Lanka, was that there's quite a bit of there isn't so much, let's say, policy on this. So what I was wondering is whether is that like just because of a lack of like resources in the government and expertise, or is there also kind of more of, how can I say, like a lack of political will to really create such guidelines and policy for planned relocation at the national level?
Yeah, I think as I stated before, there is a policy document called NIRP, National Involuntary Resettlement Policy, but it's not an act, right? So therefore, if it is an act, then the government can ask the relevant, implementers to use or do the relocation according to the given act. But when there is a policy, like for instance, depending on the resources, depending on the knowledge, sometimes some government institutions can say that they are not in a position to do the relocation according to NIRP, so therefore they might come up with a different policy guideline, and they will get cabinet approval for that, and they will try to implement. So the point is now, for instance, during the war in Sri Lanka, soon after the war, there was a ministry, a new ministry called Ministry of Resettlement, started under a special act. And there was a center called Resettlement Center, also started like Disaster Management Center under a special act to relocate, resettle people who were displaced due to war. But what happened was, 5 years later, the government already demolished, or they just they stopped this ministry, saying that the people who were displaced due to war has already been relocated or resettled. Then therefore there is no need for a ministry. So the point is, but when it comes to other types of relocation, as I stated before, they are mainly handled by different ministries. So sometimes they don't have any integration or inter discussions with regard to other ministries. Like for example, now as I stated before, now this in relation to CRIP project, that is mainly implemented by Ministry of Irrigation. So they don't get the assistance of Ministry of Housing. So Ministry of Irrigation, they just form their project office, and project office will run for 5 years or 6 years, and they are the ones who do the relocation with the assistance of Ministry of Land, because Ministry of Land should be there to acquire government land for relocation. So as I stated before, these are like ad hoc. As a result, we should see more relocation failures. And as even Chandni said, these are not people-centered. People-centered, there are no people-centered relocation policies. Like for instance, one can discuss the policy guidelines with the people, but if we are not open for any kind of changes, then there is no point of discussing these points with people. Like for example, with regard to tsunami and other related housings, we already posed this question, whether they have already, the officials, whether they have already discussed the plans with you, or whether they have already shown the identified locations to you, whether they have got your input to the housing structures. But most of the people said no. So in that context, we can't, treat it as a kind of a like public hearing, or because these public hearings, only one-way public hearings, and that does not change the existing or the draft policy guidelines before relocation. So it's a kind of a one-way process, I would say. So which we should discourage.
Thanks a lot, Nishara. We're going to now move to the questions in the Q&A box. I see great questions on cultural values, recovery from the mental trauma of relocation, see questions around capacity building, and also like where the funding for planned relocation comes from. And I think Filimone already mentioned a few interesting things about a 3% tax on plastic, and it would be really interesting to hear also from him what whether that actually works and whether it provides enough revenue, and what maybe other sources are. But so I think Filimone would probably be the best to answer specifically that question. But for the other, for all presenters, we still have almost 15 minutes, let's say 10 to 15 minutes. So maybe you probably have some preference of which question to answer. So just in the order of Filimone, Chandni, then Nishara, just take 2 or 3 minutes to speak to the question that you most feel inclined to answer. So starting with Filimone.
Thank you. So just on that topic of the environment climate levy that Fiji had to legislate. I think this was an important action for the government of Fiji, because we needed to showcase to our development partners and donors that we are also playing a part in trying to meet the needs in the relocation of our community. So although it's just 3% from this environment climate levy, it goes a long way in terms of giving our donors the belief that we also actively engage as a country, taking that bold step. And we also have quite a small economy as well, so it is not an easy decision for an economy as ourselves to be cutting things tighter for the relocation of communities. But apart from that, we're now going into the loss and damage fund that has been discussed in the UNFCCC this year, and we are hopeful that this loss and damage fund could be implemented so that it could assist countries like ourselves with the relocation of communities through funding. Thank you.
Thank you, Filimone. Was there any other question you would like to address from the box? You would still have a minute or so.
It's okay. I could give it over to the next panelist to take it ahead.
Okay. Thank you. Chandni.
Yeah, I think I'll pick up the question about what is once people move and there's either mental trauma because of the moving or because of what they've been exposed to, and how are people dealing with that. I think what, at least from the Indian experience, what we've seen is in some cases, of course, the state has also stepped in and actually had programs to, first of all, assess mental trauma and then actually help through counselors and very targeted programs, sometimes for children in particular, enrolling school teachers and, building capacities of school teachers to provide that kind of counseling support. I think a lot of the lessons for all of this were learned post the tsunami, and I'm sure Nishara will have examples from Sri Lanka where there was this collective trauma that so many people had gone through and the state stepped in. But in the absence, in some places, of course, where state capacities itself weren't there, I think there was a lot of bridging role that the civil society played, the humanitarian agencies, both international and domestic. Of course, not all of them are equally successful, and you also have examples where certain communities that are more visible. So, for example, at least in India, in the coastal areas, fishing communities tend to get much more support, and that continues even today post-cyclones, whereas farmers in coastal areas don't get as much support. So there is also a bit of differentiation in the kinds of support people can get, especially for mental trauma. And I think something that we don't often talk about, and this is what we had actually done in some of our research, was the role of art and culture and different forms of art, so dance and theater, in helping people get over traumatic experiences, which I don't think we should ask the government to do this, and especially in countries like ours where the government is as it is stretched. So there's a role that we can imagine for other kinds of actors to come in. I can imagine, like, we have these big philanthropic organizations. Why can't they fund some of this more arts and humanities kind of engagement, which helps us deal with trauma much more than perhaps just an enumerator going and assessing what that trauma is and then finding some 3 counseling sessions are the solution to that, you know. So I think there are various ways we can also reimagine some of this work around overcoming, or even overcoming is not the right word, I would say, at least recognizing and acknowledging the trauma that is associated with moving. And I think there are also some very nice examples. We have some examples in the same sites that I was working in, and those multi-storied pictures I showed you of those houses where farming has been used, and just having gardens, that has been used as a way to start building attachment to these new places that people have come to. Playgrounds have been built with the community so that people feel a little more attached to these new places. So there are ways that one can start thinking about repairing and rebuilding that is not always about just the house and the infrastructure. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Chandni. Actually, in the question that was asked around mental trauma, Isabel asked that question. I was wondering whether the mental trauma she talked about was about the mental trauma of the planned relocation itself, which could be, or the more the mental trauma of, you know, the reason why the relocation took place, like a tsunami. And I think what you mentioned was that yes, there is a lot of like things in place on the counseling for, you know, to deal with trauma from the tsunami, for example. But it will be interesting to see if there's also some kind of counseling on maybe not necessarily trauma, but helping people psychologically to adjust to their new homes, which I think would be a good.
Yeah, I just want to, just because you mentioned that, I just want to say that because many of these fishing families that are then moved away from the coast, actually there was a very interesting art project, public art project, where all across the city of Chennai, these relocated communities could reclaim the public spaces through paintings. And they have actually done these huge murals, you know, large paintings on these relocation sites of fish and all the things that are associated with coastal lives. So I think there are some ways, and that sort of also allows people to celebrate the pride that they have in their way of living, right? Which is sort of being sidelined. So I think that's why I said, I think the arts need to be thought of rather than just building physical structures all the time.
Yeah, thanks, Chandni. Nishara, over to you. Which of the questions would you like to address?
Yes, I think I quickly addressed a few questions. I think Aryan, there's a very important question. The lack of narrative around intangible indicators of loss and damage is also reflected in risk vulnerability assessment, where such indicators are not considered since it is difficult to quantify them. So could a newer way of assessing risks which focuses on these intangible indicators be a way of also bringing about a new way of understanding recovery resilience? I think this is a very important question, but I don't have an answer. But I know the value of intangible assets. Like, for instance, let me just give you, because now, for example, when it comes to relocation, we are not very much concerned about access to common property resources, which are very, 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 very vital. Now, for instance, when I was doing the social impact assessment for the World Bank on this CRIP project, this climate resilience improvement project, so it's about a particular river. So there were places where people get together, like bathing spots. So these are the spots where they interact and they try to develop interrelationships, plus they also maintain their social harmony between different groups. So which is a very, very, very vital spot. So as a result of relocation, I know that, you know, these places are going to, you know, disappear. So therefore, you know, it's a matter of like researchers to highlight the importance of these positions and try and, reconstruct these places somewhere else to, maintain these relationships, not only between different ethnic groups, but also between different class groups. So I think so in that way, we can also stress the importance of such important places. And also there is another very important questions referred to me with regard to mentioned lack of experience on the part of resettlement. This is very, very important with regard to my experience, because most of the officials work at the local and local level, and also the provincial level. They don't have any knowledge about relocation. So I think, if we are planning something, I think it's very, very vital for us to train the local level officials, all the officials working at the local level about about their policies, how they are going to implement the policies, and how they have already developed the policies, and also how to monitor and evaluate the progress, which is very, very vital, because they are the ones who are very closely working with the people, affected people at the ground level. So when you go and, normally when you go and speak to them, when they say, this is the first time we are handling this kind of settlement and we don't know anything about relocation, and after 5 years they say, now we know what we have already done, but there were a lot of mistakes, but they say that, now we can't do anything because there were a lot of mistakes, but now based on that experience we can do something more. So I think we don't have to listen to these kind of stories. So therefore I think it's very vital for us to educate and strengthen the capacities of especially the local level officials. And yeah, and the final question, I think also can each panel speaker mention a little more on how the relocation process are funded? But as you know, as I mentioned you before, because most of the settlements which I have already studied, they have not considered relocation as a process. This is very, very vital. Even in the World Bank discussions, ADB discussions, I already requested them to identify relocation as a process in your guidelines. Right, but most of the guidelines, they consider only before and soon after stages. So in that context, the before and soon after, they need only 1 to 2 years, right? Maximum 3 years. So I mean, either government can fund it, or government can get the help of different international organizations in order to fund before and soon after stages. So this is what I have already found based on my research. And I think this is what I can answer. Thank you, Kees.
Thank you, Nishara. I'm afraid we're getting to the end of this nice session. I would like to very warmly thank our 3 speakers for their wonderful contributions. And I've learned a lot on the more national perspective on planned relocation. And also many thanks to the participants for joining and asking such great questions. We're gonna see many of you back this afternoon. I want to quickly hand over to Himanshu, who just would say a few words to say goodbye.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Kees, and thanks a lot to Nishara, Chandni, and Filimone for amazing inputs. I learned a lot. And to take the discussions forward, we would be looking at where the evidence is, what sort of information we have when it comes to numbers, and that's what the next session is going to be about in precisely 4 hours from now. So do join us again. For now, it's time to let you enjoy your lunch break, your evening break, or go back to your bed or start your day because you are joining from all across the world. Thank you so much. It was a real pleasure, and we see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.